This is information that I wish I had been able to use when I was in my 20s. It would have saved me a lot of grief. It really would have, because all the time that I wasted, with drinking, with unproductive activity, and, the way that I missed opportunities to love and be loved and to have a happier life. This is really, really news that people can use.
So let's start with enjoyment then.
Yeah. So enjoyment seems sort of straightforward. I want to enjoy my life. Get a lot of pleasure. That's wrong. Pleasure is limbic. Enjoyment involves the prefrontal cortex. Enjoyment is a much more complex phenomenon than pleasure. Pleasure is a signal from the limbic system that says this thing that you're doing will help you survive, usually through caloric needs, or pass on your genes through something like sex. So that's what pleasure is really all about. It's just like any positive emotion. It sends a signal saying, do more of this. That's not the secret of happiness. That's incredibly evanescent. It's extremely temporary. And if you pursue pleasure, what you'll be doing is you'll be engaging systems in your brain, the dopamine system, for example, which is the anticipation of reward, the reward being pleasure. You'll hit the lever, get the cookie, hit the lever, get the cookie. It will never last and you'll become an addict. Pleasure seeking, the hippie phenomenon, the hippie motto of if it feels good, do it, is life-ruining advice. It's just the dumbest thing ever. If it feels good, do it. You'd never go into the ice bath.
Right.
You wouldn't stay married. If it feels good, do it all the time. It's just terrible advice. What do you need for enjoyment? The answer is the source of pleasure, adding two things, people and memory. That's where you're engaging your prefrontal cortex. So, Anheuser-Busch never runs ads for beer of a dude alone in his apartment pounding a 12-pack. They never do that, right? A lot of people use the product that way. Why don't they show that? Because that's the pursuit of pleasure, and that's dangerous. That's bad for you. Use of methamphetamine is bad for you. What we're incredibly good at using science today is to take things that give a little bit of pleasure evolutionarily and supercharge them. So, the natural endorphins that you get that will block pain under normal circumstances, we can supercharge them in a lab and make fentanyl, and 100,000 people died last year. Right? And that pursuit of that pleasure is utterly ruinous. We can take something that is, we look at a random series of events, and when it's random, we get payoffs a little bit. We'll seek those events, and that gives us a little bit of pleasure. We turn that into slot machines in Vegas. And then you're sitting there at 4 a.m. by yourself. That's really, really bad for you. That's the problem. Seeking pleasure alone, not making memory, will make you miserable. Usually if something gives you pleasure and you're doing it alone, you're usually doing it wrong. Pornography is a problem. It uses the sexual function in a way that leads to addiction and huge problems in people's lives. It's contraindicated. It's not good for especially young people to use that, but that's the same thing as fentanyl in this way. Okay. So what do? You make sure you're with people, especially the people you love, and you're making memories. That's why Anheuser-Busch's ads have 2 dudes or 10 dudes or a family cracking open a bud and drinking it and laughing. Because in the ad, they want you to associate the beer with happiness, which is enjoyment is the central factor, not the pleasure that the little bit of alcohol will bring you. And that's what we need to do. That's the strategy.
It's very interesting. We're working on and maybe by the time this podcast come out, it'll be out. But we're working on a very, very in-depth newsletter on basically the conflicting data on alcohol,
right?
Specifically around wine,
right?
So why is it that at a biochemical level, and certainly looking at the Mendelian randomizations, alcohol is toxic at any dose, and it's a monotonically increasing function. So there's no amount of alcohol that is healthy. Yet the epidemiology is pretty significantly in favor of modest drinking over abstinence. And once you even strip out all of the obvious confounders that would lead to that, you're left with the phenomenon you describe. If you dig into the data really deeply, it's the Mediterranean drinking pattern that seems to be associated with some benefits at low doses.
It's people and memory.
Right, and it's
not the alcohol per se.
The food and the wine and the people combo that seems to be beneficial, not the vodka and Red Bull in the dorm issue.
Exactly right.
And those are, even though it's the same molecule, it's a very different experience.
Yeah, processed sugar is the same thing. You find that people who eat candy 1 to 3 times a month on average live a year longer than people who abstain completely from candy. Candy's terrible for you.
Right.
It rots your teeth. It leads to metabolic syndrome. Eating candy 1 to 3 times a day is very different than eating it 1 to 3 times a month. And so the whole point is you do something that you enjoy, but that means that you're giving something that gives you a little bit of pleasure, which, something really sweet does because of our evolution. Something that gives you a little bit of euphoria, like alcohol, makes you feel good. But you do it with people and you make a memory, in which case you're almost certainly doing, unless all your friends are drunks, which is bad, you can get into an unhealthy community, that you're doing it in a pretty moderate way. And then it's life enhancing, despite the fact that it's a poison. And you can use a little bit of poison in a productive way, but it has to be about enjoyment, never about pleasure, per se.
Such an interesting distinction.
Totally. And it took, I'm 59. It took me this long. This is information that I wish I had been able to use when I was in my 20s. It would have saved me a lot of grief. It really would have, because all the time that I wasted, with drinking, with just unproductive activity, and, the way that I missed opportunities to love and be loved and to have a happier life. This is really, really news that people can use.
And this is probably one of the stronger arguments against evolution being in favor of happiness. It's clear that evolution is in favor of pleasure.
Yeah.
Pleasure might be one of the most potent fuels that drives the engine of evolution, at least when it comes to reproduction, but certainly other aspects of evolution as well.
You're exactly right.
But enjoyment is a higher order process, and I guess would not necessarily have the same evolutionary drive. Although I suppose that being with people obviously also has a strong evolutionary bent, if for no other reason than we couldn't have survived alone, even through the industrialization of agriculture.
No, absolutely right. The problem is that the maladaptation that comes with technological progress is that you can strip off the component of enjoyment that is pleasure and then supercharge it in the lab. That's the problem. The internet makes it possible to do that. Chemistry makes it easy to do that. There are all kinds of ways that we strip out that component of enjoyment. So it's no longer part of the evolved societies that would have been more traditional.